Hello, I'm Dr. Jodie Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. Do you believe that you are naturally averse to exercise, or have you been blessed with sporty genes? Do you think that stress is inherently debilitating, or do you think that sometimes it can be enhancing and energising? Do you associate age with wisdom and personal development, or do you think that as you get older, it's simply a period of disability and decline? Our expectations are like the air that we breathe. They accompany us everywhere, but we're rarely aware of their presence around us. And what's really important is that those beliefs in themselves can shape important outcomes. This is how my guest today, David Robson, opened his TED Talk, The Expectation Effect, How Our Beliefs Create Reality. Welcome to another episode of Well, Hello Anxiety. I'm Dr. Jodie Richardson, speaker, author, and of course, your host. Our guest today is David Robson. He's an award-winning science writer specialising in the extremes of the human brain, body, and behaviour. He worked as a features editor at New Scientist for 5 years before moving to BBC Future, where he was a senior journalist for another 5 years. He won the Mental Health Story of the Year in 2022 at the Medical Journalists Association Annual Awards, and in 2022 was also a finalist for the British Science Journalist of the Year Award. David is the author of 2 books, The Intelligence Trap and The Expectation Effect, How Your Mindset Can Transform Your Life. Thank you, David, for joining us, and welcome to the podcast.
It's completely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. David, can you please tell us about the expectation effect and the fact that when you first started thinking about this or learning about this, you're a little on the skeptical side?
Right. I guess I've always been interested in kind of self-help as a genre of books, and especially if it's evidence-based. But the idea that your beliefs can create self-fulfilling prophecies, for me, had previously felt a bit too close to this idea of manifesting or the kind of work in The Secret and that kind of positive thinking book, where it seemed like it was too kind of Pollyanna-ish. This idea that if you're just relentlessly optimistic, that good things will happen to you and that you can send good vibes out into the universe and then that will bring what you want into your house or into your life. But the expectation effect isn't that phenomenon at all. So it's very much about how your beliefs can create self-fulfilling prophecies, but it's through these very well-studied, very well understood mechanisms through changes to your perception, changes to your physiology, and changes to your behaviour. And they're all interlinked, those mechanisms. But, we already had a huge body of research that this was possible from the study of the placebo effect in medicine. And what we saw there was that when you give patients positive expectations that a sham treatment might treat their illness, sure, it improves their mood, it kind of provides some comfort, some emotional comfort. But actually what the more recent research has showed is that it's also kind of traceable to physiological changes within their body, real objective things that you can measure. So if a patient believes they're taking a pain-killing drug, what you can often see is that they have the release of endogenous opioids in the brain that act as kind of natural painkillers, and that can explain the relief that they're feeling. And actually, if you give someone even a real drug like morphine, but you do it surreptitiously, you actually typically only get half the benefit compared to if a doctor shows the patient what they're doing and administers the morphine themselves. And that's because that interaction raises the expectations of pain relief and is perhaps then triggering this release of the brain's own opioids as well as the opioids in the morphine. So, digging into all of that research, it became very clear to me that actually there are specific mechanisms that can lead to expectation effects. And then when I was researching the book, I was just looking at how that extends beyond medicine to other areas of our lives, so how we deal with stress, how we cope with exercise, how we respond to a new diet and even how we age. But in each case, it's all through very specific mechanisms. There's none of this kind of pseudoscience of having a law of attraction or anything like that. It's all very well understood scientifically.
Yes, and when I was preparing to meet you and to learn more about the expectation effect and learning more about you and the work you've done and being a scientist myself and having an academic background, I was very excited to have the opportunity to speak to you, knowing that what we discuss, particularly on this topic, that can be misunderstood, and that you've dispelled those myths in the answer to my first question. But I think it's really important for me as a host and also my podcast community who know that they can trust when they're listening to a guest, especially on a topic like this, which can be a little tricky to understand, that how can our thinking actually impact our physiology? And there are some fascinating examples that I know you'll share with us today. But could you start, please, by helping our listeners to understand what's the mechanism? So, how does a patient, knowing that a doctor is administering morphine, in addition to the actual administering of the morphine, how does that belief and that understanding and that knowledge actually transfer to improved effects?
To get to the bottom of this, you really need to understand that the brain evolved as what some neuroscientists describe as a prediction machine. And what they mean by that is just that pretty much at every level of the brain's processing, it's building these simulations of the world around it and what it thinks is going to happen in the next few seconds, hours, days, even across your lifetime. But it's always trying to preempt what's going to occur. And that's incredibly important for sensory processing, because actually the light hitting your retinas, that pattern of light is incredibly messy and often contains lots of ambiguous information. And our predictions help us to tidy that up and fill in the blind spots that we might have, or sometimes remove some extra information that isn't relevant for our perception. We know that that's very fundamental in the way we actually experience the world sensually. But it's also really important in preparing the body for the kinds of challenges that it's going to face, because those simulations will help to change things like the levels of your hormones, for example, your blood pressure, inflammation, the actions of the immune system. All of these things will be influenced by those simulations. And it makes complete evolutionary sense, because it just means you're more responsive, more flexible to your environment, better able to deal with a whole range of challenges compared to, say, something like a nematode worm or something like that. It only has very limited options for what it's going to do. Now, in the case of medicine with the placebo effect, there could be two layers to this. The first could be just that when you're having that medical encounter and you're receiving the placebo, it's a kind of ritual that shows that you're being cared for. And so that means that the body can kind of switch gears in its healing response. So it goes from dealing with the kind of initial threat where you've been injured, you've got lots of pain, it's putting you in a state of panic to kind of get help and to get to safety. And then it's pushing you into this kind of more relaxed state where the body can actually start healing those wounds because it knows you're being cared for. So it can do things like reduce inflammation for that reason, because actually when you're no longer in danger of having more wounds inflicted, you need less inflammation and more of the direct kind of immune response with antibodies that can attack specific pathogens. Similarly, it can reduce the amount of pain you're feeling, because if you're in safety, you don't need that huge warning to get to safety. So it can afford to remove those signals and to dampen them a little bit. So that's one level. Now, when we see the specific release of chemicals like opioids, if you're expecting to receive morphine, or cannabinoids if you're expecting to receive another type of painkiller, well, that's through a different mechanism called conditioning. And essentially, if you've received those pills in the past, your body kind of knows that it's going to be getting these chemicals kind of flooding through the body, flooding through the brain, and it's kind of easing the way for those. So actually releasing its own opioids is kind of already helping to kickstart things before the real drug gets to you. And so that's really the thinking with when we do see that release, the very strong release of those endogenous opioids when you're expecting to receive morphine. It's really through this conditioning response, in addition to that general kind of healing response that comes from the medical ritual.
What a fascinating journey you must have been on as you were researching the book and learning more about the studies that are demonstrating the expectation effect. And I wonder if on this journey that you've been on, if there was a particular area where the expectation effect rings true that made a personal difference for you in your life.
I mean, I would say I kind of apply everything that I learnt in the book. And that's because I was very careful with choosing the academic research, the evidence, to make sure that it had been replicated and that you had multiple strands of research from different groups using different ways of exploring the topics, just to make sure that what I was describing was very robust. But then I also wanted to kind of test things personally to know that it's actually easy to apply, not in the laboratory, but in your real life. I did try to do that with everything, but the one that really kind of, I think, was most transformative was dealing with anxiety, which I'd suffered from quite a lot previously, but then especially this anxiety to do with kind of performing in public, with public speaking. When I wrote my first book, suddenly I couldn't hide behind my laptop. I had to get up and present these ideas to hundreds or thousands of people. And that filled me with a lot of dread. Never enjoyed that kind of event at school, tried to avoid it in adult life. But what I found researching the expectation effect was that our expectations, our beliefs about stress and anxiety can become self-fulfilling prophecies. So if you believe that stress and anxiety are going to cause you to fail, that actually harms your performance. If you believe that stress and anxiety can be energizing and enhancing, that they can actually be a resource that you can use, then that becomes your self-fulfilling prophecy. This has been researched in lots of different ways, but one of my favorite examples just asked people to reframe the sensations that they were feeling and explained the evolutionary purpose of anxiety. So these students were all going to take these very difficult GRE exams, they're graduate exams that you need to kind of progress in education. And as part of the kind of mock exam booklet, there was just a paragraph explaining to these students how when your heart is racing, that might not feel comfortable, but it's actually pumping a lot of oxygen to your brain, which is helping you to think more clearly. And say cortisol the stress hormone, well, that might lead you to feel kind of a bit kind of wired and on edge. But actually, when you're doing a difficult exam, you really want to be on the ball and focused. And the cortisol can actually help you to achieve that focus. So they gave that message to half the participants. Half the participants didn't see that same kind of information that would help them to reappraise and reframe the feelings. And then they took the exam. And they found that that simply seeing the purpose of those feelings and realizing that actually even discomfort can come with these advantages, that improved their performance on these exams, and especially in the part of the exam that they found most difficult, the mathematics kind of questions. And then they saw a really significant increase in their scores because they were turning their anxiety to their advantage rather than allowing it to debilitate their performance. That's now been shown in lots of different contexts, including public speaking for people with social anxiety, and it really rings true each time. And I personally then have applied that, my own talks, and public speaking has gone from being something that I would dread to something that I really enjoy. And actually, it's been important for my personal growth to realize that my anxiety was there partly because I really wanted to perform well. And just by reframing how the anxiety could help me to achieve that goal, it's really helped make the process so much better. And so now I actually kind of relish this opportunity to be able to communicate all this research I've done to a wider audience.
Yes, and you can, and you are a science journalist, you're a science communicator, and communication goes way beyond the pen and paper, I should say, or the keyboard.
Exactly.
Doesn't it
Yeah.
now? And it makes it more accessible for people.
Mm.
And it just goes to show here on the podcast, when I first met you, I thought, David is such a calm soul. And you've got this calm about you. And yet I think that's a really beautiful example for people listening who have anxiety in their lives that affects them in different ways. And to know that you've gone from the point of experiencing a lot of dread, a lot of anxiety around public speaking, to enjoying it. And that only comes through the experience, doesn't it? And that reframe makes such a difference. And so I really appreciate that you've been able to share that personal example with us and also the particular strategy that you've been putting into practice that's been shown to be so effective. We've talked about the expectation effect briefly from a medical point of view in terms of pain relief, and you've shared an example just now about anxiety, but there really are various domains of our life in which this is really impactful. One of the things that I spoke about in the opening when I was repeating what you said in your TED Talk opening was around exercise. And it's a part of my life that I love. I've always, I guess, had a belief. It was interesting listening to you ask those questions, writing them down and repeating them, because I was obviously generating my own answers about where I sit in relation to the questions that you were asking, and no doubt our listeners were too. And I guess my beliefs have always been that I am a sporty person, that it's something that has always been a part of my life. And so I enjoy exercise. I don't find it hard to get out. In fact, I miss it when I can't do it. But that's a really important part of our life, especially as we get older. And so what did you learn about the expectation effect and exercise that might help our listeners to be able to think differently and adopt a new mindset about their relationship with exercise?
Well, I think there was one study in particular that really stuck in my mind and changed my own attitudes to exercise. And that came from Stanford University. And the researchers invited participants into their lab for an endurance test on a treadmill. But they also gave them a genetic test. So it was looking at one specific gene called CREB1, which we know does have an effect on things like physical stamina. If you have like the kind of, in inverted commas, like good version of the gene, you do tend to have better stamina. And it also affects things like the gas exchange within your lungs, how hot your body becomes when you're exercising compared to people who have the kind of negative version of the gene. But the researchers wanted to test whether they could give sham feedback to the participants and whether just the expectation of having the good or bad gene would actually shape performance. And that's exactly what they found, that people who believed they had the good version of the gene performed better than the people who believed they had the bad version of the gene. And sometimes the effects of the expectations were more important than the effects of the gene itself. So, for example, when we're talking about releasing carbon dioxide and bringing in oxygen into the body, that efficiency of the lungs was actually influenced more by the expectation than the gene itself. Not many of us, I'm guessing, will have had genetics tests that will kind of tell us whether we have this gene or not. But I think we kind of carry beliefs about whether we're natural at sport or not, just from previous experience or what we've been told at school, what our parents might have told us, or how they modelled exercise for us. And so for me personally, I think it's just really important to question those narratives. I'd always believed that I had the bad sports genes, that I wasn't really capable, partly because I was the youngest in my year, the smallest. I was never going to win the races at sports day or anything like that. And even though I'd been a conscientious exerciser, I'd always had these kind of negative assumptions, this baggage that came with exercise. So I'd always found it quite an ordeal. But then, having researched how our expectations can shape sports performance, I just started trying to question those narratives and just kind of came to the realization that I'm never going to be an Olympic athlete, but actually I don't have any disabilities that should prevent me from doing exercise. So the truth is, the more I do, the more I should benefit. And if I focus on that trajectory and again, reframe my feelings during the exercise. So reframe those feelings of exhaustion, of the aching, the breathlessness. If I reframe that as being a sign of growth rather than kind of evidence of my lack of fitness, that can help make the experience feel so much more positive. And that's exactly what I found, was that actually working out, like my public speaking, went from being this kind of ordeal to being something that I really value in my life. And actually the ritual now of going to the gym pretty much every day, or on the days I can't, of doing these high intensity workouts at home, that ritual has actually been really beneficial, not just to my physical health, but to my mental health too. So it really has become something that I've appreciated so much more when I was able to question those previous narratives.
Oh, what a great example. You're turning my attention to some of the people that I train with when I do my exercise. And I think and I might be wrong, but I think the eldest is 80. And so you're allowed to train at this particular gym from 16, and it's very high intensity exercise. It's CrossFit. And I look around, and one of the things I love about it is that it's about starting where you're at, starting with the baseline that you're at, and then making incremental increases in whether or not that's the volume, like the distance that you might run, or the time that you might do an activity for, or the weight that you're lifting, the intensity that you're working. And a really great way for listeners who know how passionate I am about exercise for so many reasons to know that you are adapting is to start small and notice how when you continue to do just that one particular challenge, whether or not it's a little jog to the nearest lamppost and back once a day, then how that gets easier over time, and at which point you can notice that and then maybe go to the second lamppost. We can start really small, but if we start continuing to increase the challenge for ourselves, we don't get to appreciate the adaptation and the growth that we've experienced along the way. So I really appreciate that example. And it's quite fascinating, isn't it, that those athletes, or it was general population, I imagine, actually, in the Stanford study, general population or college students perhaps, whereby the genetic testing showed that whether or not you had the genes for endurance or not, the belief that you had them made such a powerful difference. And just on that, I wanted to also note that particularly for children, I'm a parent, and I think the role modelling that you mentioned is so important for us as parents, that even if as a parent you don't consider yourself a sporty person, hopefully you can take a great leaf out of David's book in theory and in practice and start to talk about that differently in your home, but also know that the beliefs that our children have about their exercise will greatly influence their participation, and that can have knock-on effects for them in lots of ways. So I think this is such an important conversation, David. So thank you.
I totally agree. And modelling that for children is so important. And kind of, especially with children, I think just recognising that exercise can be fun and to emphasise all the positive feelings that come out of exercise. Because actually this research on reframing had shown that when you can reframe, say, aching muscles as being a sign of growth rather than a sign of failure, that actually then does encourage the release of endorphins that are going to give you that high after your exercise. But I think if parents are talking down exercise, if they're always like, even if they do it, but they kind of talk about, how much of a struggle it is, act as if it's kind of this sheer act of willpower rather than something that you would do for pleasure, I think that can be quite damaging for children. And sometimes, like, when I'm working out, I'm just not in the right mood to be pushing myself hard. So on those days I just think, well, how can I make it as fun and comfortable as possible? Like, I don't always have to be striving to beat my personal best, but actually it's better to do some exercise and to really enjoy it than to do none at all. And the irony is that on those days when I've made my motivation just purely for pleasure and for feeling good, I've often found that my metrics are much better on those days than when I've been kind of striving towards a goal. So yeah, I think there's lots of conversations we could be having about this and how we teach children to appreciate exercise as a really valuable part of their life, not just for their health, but also for their emotional well-being.
So true. And one of the things I love to say is that, if we get ourselves off to CrossFit and we're not feeling it, because sometimes, like you just said, sometimes you just don't feel it, and you can give yourself a really big pat on the back just for turning up. But I like to think I'm lapping everyone else who's sitting on the couch.
Yeah, exactly.
And so anything's better than nothing. Anything's better than nothing. And even just a short walk can be transformative when it comes to our mood. It's consistency. It's start small and be consistent. That's much more powerful over time than the odd huge workout that sets you back because you do feel you've done it, you've overdone it, and you don't feel great in the days following. So one of the other things that I know you've written about that's particularly interesting for me and relates, I think, in some ways to what a previous guest, Dr. Helena Popovic, spoke about, is the idea of the expectation effect and perception around food and around our waistline. What can you tell us about that?
Right. So I think, like, when we're trying to lose weight, we often focus just on the on cutting calories, and that becomes our priority rather than the pleasure or interest or excitement that we might get from food. We kind of brush that away, and it's almost like an act of penitence that we've overindulged at Christmas or, at a birthday party, and then we have to kind of cut back. Now, the research on the expectation effect really suggests that can backfire quite badly. And it can do that through changes to our perception of the food, but also to our body's response to the food that we're eating. Now, when we are only focusing on having kind of low calorie foods, it's putting us into this kind of feeling of deprivation. And it's that mindset actually triggers hunger because your body and your brain starts to think, well, if food is short now, I have to kind of stock up on as many calories as possible because there might be a famine in the future. That's essentially the evolutionary kind of mechanism behind this. And that obviously is the last thing that you want. So it's actually, going to increase your hunger pangs and make it harder for you to resist temptation. And we know this from lots of studies, but one of my favorite studies looked at people's attitudes to milkshakes. Now, they took the same milkshake on two separate occasions. So nutritionally, the milkshakes were exactly the same, but the labeling was completely different. So on one day, it was labeled as this kind of sensible, low-calorie health shake with very vanilla kind of marketing, nothing that emphasized the flavor, the pleasure that you might receive from that. And they were told it had a very small number of calories, maybe 200 calories. With the other shake, on the other day, they had exactly the same shake, but it was painted as this luxurious, decadent treat. The labeling mentioned how much ice cream was in there, how much cream was in the milkshake, all the flavorings that had gone into it. And they were told it had significantly more calories this time, so maybe 600 or 700 calories, but, enough to be a substantial snack, almost a meal replacement, but a real treat, something you'd find really satisfying. Now, on both occasions, the researchers measured levels of the hormone ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. So when ghrelin is high, that stimulates appetite. And when it drops, you feel less hungry. You don't have that need to seek out more food. Now, what typically happens when we eat a big meal is that ghrelin might peak just beforehand because it's very tempting what's in front of you. It's good to feel appetite when you have food that's available, but then it drops significantly afterwards because your brain knows, and as a result your body knows, that you've had all the nutrition you need for the time being and you don't need to go looking for further food. And that's exactly what they saw when people drank this milkshake, believing it was this luxurious, decadent treat. They saw the peak and then the trough in the ghrelin levels. But with the people who were drinking, when they were drinking the health shake, that sensible low-calorie shake, the ghrelin levels just barely changed at all. They stayed at a higher level and just at a very stable kind of level, as if they hadn't eaten. And that's counterproductive, because if you're dieting, that's going to mean that then if your brain doesn't really think you've had enough calories, it's going to start looking for them elsewhere. So you're going to reach for the cookie jar. You're going to maybe eat a bigger portion at your next meal because you feel that you haven't had enough. Now, ghrelin's important because it seems to also affect things like metabolism. So if you have higher levels of ghrelin, it seems to slow your metabolism. And that's because if you're in this kind of mindset of deprivation, you would need to preserve energy. So you're not going to be burning your fat as quickly as if you have lower levels of ghrelin. Now, again, that's the last thing you want if you're dieting, because you want to be eating fewer calories, but burning energy at the same level.
Absolutely fascinating. And when you talk about ghrelin, and literally as if on cue, my tummy just rumbled. One of my kids is cooking our dinner at the moment, and I often think about, when I was learning about these hunger hormones, I often think about ghrelin and growling as a way to sort of remember which one's the hunger hormone. So I started thinking about the salmon that's waiting for me when we finish our conversation. And I think too, we know that dieting isn't effective. We know that predominantly when people diet, they end up putting the weight back on and often end up heavier than when they started. And whilst this is obviously not a podcast about weight loss, but I think it's quite a pervasive part of so many people's lives. And I think it's really helpful and reduces the stress and anxiety around weight and health. because the size you are isn't necessarily an indicator of how healthy you are and how fit you are. And so that's a really important point to make as well. But I really appreciate those insights because it matters what we eat, it matters what we think about what we eat, and the perceptions of what it is that we're eating. So it's so interesting. And I wonder, in all your research as you were writing the book, and no doubt many other articles, what surprised you the most about the expectation effect?
The most surprising results, and the ones that I felt most skeptical about when I started researching them, was the effect of our beliefs about aging on our longevity. So there was a big study in 2002, so more than 20 years ago, that had followed people across their lifespan, so definitely from before middle age right through to their 70s and 80s. And just before kind of middle age, or before maybe in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, they'd question these people about how they saw their future. Did they think that their life was going to get better as they got older, that it would stay the same, or was it going to get significantly worse as they aged? What the study showed was that those beliefs predicted how long these people lived, and the difference was about 7.5 years. So a really big proportion of the lifespan, which is incredible. That was a longitudinal study, so we have to be a little bit skeptical if we just see one of those results, because you don't know if other confounding factors might have influenced the finding. But actually, it has just been replicated now in so many different contexts and looking at so many different specific age-related diseases. That includes things like cardiovascular disease and also Alzheimer's disease. And what we see with that is that people's beliefs about aging, if they associate aging with a kind of positive period of growth, and they appreciate that some things improve as you get older, like you become wiser, your general knowledge increases, your vocabulary is at its peak in your 70s. People recognize that it does come with these benefits. They're about half as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease as the people who only see old age as a period of decline and vulnerability. And you can see that in the biological markers of Alzheimer's disease, so the amount of amyloid plaques that are building in the brain. So that in itself was very convincing. But then as I dug further, I realized there's also a very clear mechanism that can link this. And that's always important for me. Like, can we actually explain how your beliefs would lead to a longer life? And actually you can. And these mechanisms are they're almost like common sense. Once you hear about them, they seem like common sense. And the first is that if you have a positive view of aging, you are more likely to exercise, to take care of yourself, to remain active as you get older. Equally importantly is those beliefs about aging are going to change how vulnerable and anxious you feel as you get older. So if you see old age as a time of disability and frailty, and you don't recognize that there are any advantages to that, all of the kind of small challenges you face in your day-to-day life, things like going to the shops, meeting new people, driving to a new location, are going to become significantly more scary. You're going to worry that you'll forget people's names, get lost on the route, all of these things that you start imagining could go wrong. The study showed that once you reach those milestone ages of, say, 60 or 70, that results in higher levels of cortisol, chronically high levels of cortisol that just keep on increasing if you have the negative view of aging, compared to those with the positive view of aging, who actually see a reduction in cortisol because they're kind of relaxing into this golden age of their life. And the higher levels of cortisol, they correspond to higher levels of inflammation in the body. And we know that chronic inflammation can cause damage to our tissues. And then you can even see these effects in within the individual cells themselves. You can note that there are kind of different patterns in the expressions of genes that take place as we get older. That's called the epigenetic clock. And for people who have the negative beliefs, those changes just happen more quickly. Literally, the biological clock is ticking more quickly for people who believe that old age is a time of disability and frailty. And those epigenetic changes, that inflammation, all of this is going to predispose you to all of those illnesses. So over a matter of years or decades, you're much more likely to become ill and eventually to die at a younger age than you would have done if you had the positive views of aging.
I am so surprised at just the difference of 7 years. 7
0.5. Yeah, 7.5.
Goodness, that is that is a really long time and a very, very big difference. And, as I said before, I was asking myself those same questions that I repeated at the beginning, and I was thinking about my own view of aging. And I have a very positive view of aging. And one of the things that I often will say, because I'm not embarrassed about sharing my age with my audiences when I speak in person with groups, and here on the podcast, I'm happy to say I'm 49. Sometimes I can't quite believe that I'm that old, but I think aging's a gift. And I've really come to adopt this mindset because there are some mums in my local community who haven't had that gift and who have died very young. And I think that's given me this real sense of gratitude for every day and for my health, and certainly determination to continue to take good care of myself. But I was unaware of the impacts on a range of age-related diseases, including Alzheimer's. It's so interesting, and I think it's so brilliant that people like yourself, David, help make this information that's so important and can really make a significant difference in our lives. You make it so accessible. And I just want to say thank you so much for doing that for us. And before we finish up, I wondered if there's anything else that you'd like to add about what you discovered during your research into this incredible area of science before we find out where people can contact you and learn more about the work and your books, of course.
Just one kind of area that I think is very relevant to the expectation effect, even though it isn't specifically an expectation effect itself, that is the importance of self-compassion. Because one of my concerns when writing a book was that people would just see the expectation effect as another reason to beat themselves up. Because they would be like, if they fail, it must be because I didn't have the right mindset. Like, they would start to feel anxiety about not being positive enough. And that's absolutely not the message that I want to convey. Actually, I'm not asking people to be like these kind of optimistic Pollyannas, but just to question some of the negative assumptions and to try to look at situations just a little bit more objectively, like to recognize that stress, you can still acknowledge that, like, when you're doing these challenging events, like taking difficult exams or doing public speaking, it's not necessarily going to be comfortable, but you can also recognize that with the discomfort, there can come some benefits as well. And by focusing on those benefits, you can help to overcome the anxiety. Certainly not asking people to always be positive about everything and to ignore the challenges in life. And then self-compassion comes into this, really, because we know that being self-critical and beating yourself up for your failures is really counterproductive. We have this assumption that if you're your own worst critic or harshest judge, then that's going to be a motivation to kind of improve. But that's not really what the research shows. Actually, people who can forgive themselves for their mistakes tend to be in a psychologically better place to then actually enact change, to actually improve. So they tend to have much better outcomes even on the things that they might have been beating themselves up about. If they make a mistake, if they offend someone, if they fail an exam, if they get fired from their job, they're more likely to learn from that experience than people who beat themselves up and are overly self-critical. So I guess just my final message would just be to be kind to yourselves. And when applying the expectation effect, also just recognize that we're not going to succeed at everything that we try, but it's really that trajectory we should be looking at, and that sometimes it's okay just to give yourself an easy time.
Yes, I'm really pleased that you mentioned that. I think it's such an integral part to growth and change and personal development, isn't it? To be kind to ourselves. And when you were saying what you said about the likelihood of being more successful if we are compassionate, reminded me of some research I read some time ago, which talked about, it was related to eating, and if a person was minding what they were eating, but then kind of fell off the wagon, so to speak, I'm using air quotes, and had a binge or ate a donut or a chocolate bar or something that wasn't kind of part of the plan, when those people were very critical about themselves, they were more likely to then reach for more foods that are well outside of the healthy eating plan they had in mind for themselves. Whereas they show themselves that forgiveness and that compassion, they were able to get back on the wagon, I suppose, to stick with the metaphor. And so I really am so happy that you're able to share that with us. And I've shared an episode actually on self-compassion. If you, as a listener, want to go back through and listen, and I'm hoping to interview one of the world's leading experts on self-compassion very soon. So thank you, David, very much for sharing that as a final message for us. So where can our listeners learn more about you and find you online to follow you and your work?
So the book should be available from all good bookshops. It's available on Amazon, but, there's plenty of good independent bookshops that would be able to provide that too. You can find some links to those websites and shops on my website, davidrobson.me. You can find me on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it by the time this goes live. I'm I'm D_A_Robson. And I'm also on Instagram and Threads as David A. Robson. I do really love hearing from listeners and people who want to chat more about the expectation effect. So very happy to have conversations.
Thank you for sharing those details, and I'll put all of those in the show notes. David, it has been just such a pleasure talking with you and learning so much more about how our beliefs shape our reality. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'm very grateful to you for doing all of the wonderful work that you do and for sharing some of it here with us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on the podcast for another episode. It's just a joy to have your company. I'm always so grateful, and I very much look forward to being back with you with another wonderful guest again next week. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr. Jodie Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.